The heavy gates of the Silverstone circuit usually swing open for thousands of roaring fans, but today they are locked tight. Security is airtight. No cameras, no press, and definitely no rival scouts. Inside the garage, the air is thick with the scent of high-octane fuel and the nervous sweat of Japanese engineers. They aren't looking at a traditional Yamaha. They are staring at a ghost, the M1 V4 prototype. For 20 years, Yamaha lived and died by the Inline-Four engine, a masterpiece of smoothness that finally hit a brick wall against the brute force of Ducati. But then the silence is shattered. A sound that shouldn't belong to a Yamaha, a guttural, violent V4 scream tears through the British fog. On the bike is a man who wasn't even supposed to be here yet, Toprak Razgatlıoğlu. He isn't just testing a new engine, he is conducting a stress test on the laws of physics. As he flies toward Abbey Corner at over 200 miles per hour, he doesn't brake where the computer says he should. He waits, he pushes, and then he hammers the front lever. The rear wheel of the multi-million-dollar prototype snaps into the air, dancing 2 feet off the ground while the front tire screams in protest. In the pit box, the telemetry screens go red. The deceleration figures are hitting levels the sensors weren't even calibrated for. The engineers exchange looks of pure terror. They thought they were building a bike to catch Ducati, but they've just realized they've built a monster that only one man can tame. And what the Paddock discovered next would leave even the most seasoned veterans speechless. The end of an era for decades, the Yamaha M1 was the ballerina of the MotoGP grid. It was a machine defined by grace, corner speed, and a surgical inline-four engine that Valentino Rossi and Jorge Lorenzo used to carve through rivals. But in the modern era of ride-height devices and massive aerodynamic wings, that grace became a liability. Yamaha was being bullied on the straights and out-muscled in the corners. The old Yamaha philosophy was dying. The decision to build a V4 was a seismic shift, a total surrender of their technical identity to survive. But a V4 engine brings a violent power delivery that the agile M1 chassis wasn't designed to handle. Internal whispers suggested the first prototype was unrideable, a bucking bronco that sent test riders back to the pits with arm pump after only 5 laps. Yamaha needed more than an engine, they needed a rider who specialized in chaos. Enter Toprak Razgatlıoğlu. The man who made a career out of bullying superbikes into doing the impossible. When he stepped into that secret session at Silverstone, he wasn't interested in the bike's heritage. He wanted to know how hard he could hit the brakes before the chassis snapped. But as the session progressed, the engineers realized the real danger wasn't the bike breaking, it was the fact that Toprak was actually making it work. Yet this was only the beginning of a far bigger storm. Breaking the physics, the data coming off Toprak's M1 V4 wasn't just fast, it was illogical. In MotoGP, the goal is usually to keep both wheels on the ground to maximize the electronics and aero grip. Toprak ignored the manual. He brought his signature Stopie style from world superbikes directly into the world of carbon brakes and prototype tires. Insiders claim the telemetry showed deceleration forces approaching 1.8 G to 2.0 G. To put that in perspective, that's enough force to make a normal rider's vision blur. Toprak was moving the braking point 30 meters closer to the apex than the theoretical limit calculated by Yamaha's AI. Every time he entered a corner, the rear of the bike would sway and lift, a situation typically avoided by every other rider on the grid. However, for Toprak, this instability was a weapon. By letting the rear lift, he was pivoting the V4 on a dime, solving the bike's biggest weakness, mid-corner rotation. The Yamaha top brass, watching from the pit wall, remained silent for a long time. They hadn't expected the V4 bike, still in its infancy, to perform so solidly under such brutal pressure. But while the garage was buzzing with hope, a different reaction was brewing across the paddock. Paddock whispers and leaked data news of a secret test at Silverstone is impossible to keep quiet for long. Within 48 hours, the Silverstone leaks were the only thing anyone in the paddock was talking about. Rival teams, Ducati, KTM, and especially Aprilia, were scrambling for information. Rumors suggested that Toprak's lap times on the unrefined prototype were already matching the race pace of the 2025 season. Mechanics from other teams claimed something felt off about the project. How could a rider with so little experience on Michelin tires and carbon brakes find the limit so quickly? Speculation emerged that Yamaha had built a bespoke Toprak spec chassis, a rumor the factory denied, but the tension was already rising. The psychological pressure was building, not just on the rivals, but on Yamaha's own current stars. If a test rider could jump on the V4 and immediately shatter expectations, the hierarchy inside the team was about to be obliterated. But the real shock came from Italy, where one man decided he had seen enough. Arrivo LA's defiance, Massimo Rivola, the CEO of Aprilia Racing, is not a man who stays quiet when a threat emerges. Aprilia had spent years building the RSGP into the most aerodynamically advanced bike on the grid, and they weren't about to let a Yamaha revival steal their spotlight. Rivola's response to the Toprak news was a public declaration of war. He didn't just acknowledge the threat, he leaned into it. Reports suggested he ordered the Aprilia factory into brutal mode for the development of the RSGP 26. His message was clear. If Yamaha was bringing a street fighter like Toprak to MotoGP, Aprilia would build a bike that was even more ferocious. The RSGP26 was redesigned to be the most aggressive evolution in the history of the Knoll factory. The focus shifted to extreme stability under braking, the exact area where Toprak excelled. Rivola wanted a bike that could be tortured by his riders Jorge Martin and Marco Bezzecchi without losing its balance. This wasn't just a technical dispute, it was a clash of philosophies. Aprilia's aero perfection versus Toprak's raw, unhinged aggression, and the twist that followed would change the championship narrative entirely. The garage tension inside the Yamaha camp, the success of the test created a strange, uncomfortable atmosphere. While the engineers were ecstatic about the V4's potential, the management was facing a political nightmare. Toprak wasn't just a rider, he was a catalyst for a radical change in the bike's character. The M1 V4 was becoming un-Yamaha-like. It was becoming a bike that demanded a heavy setback in terms of rider comfort. It required a rider to be comfortable with the bike being constantly on the edge of a crash. For the old guard of mechanics who grew up with the smooth Inline-Four, this felt like sacrilege. Reports from insiders suggested heated arguments behind closed doors. Some believed that chasing Toprak's extreme style would alienate other riders who couldn't match his freakish braking ability. The risk was clear. If they built the bike entirely for Toprak and Toprak struggled to adapt to the long-race tire deg of MotoGP, the entire project would collapse. Yet Toprak's feedback was so precise, so undeniably fast that Yamaha had no choice but to follow his lead. The mental WARFAREAs the 2026 season approached, the battle moved from the track to the mind. Toprak's social media was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Clips of him performing impossible stoppies and laughing off the pressure of the V4 test went viral, fueling the narrative that he was the chosen one to break the Ducati dominance. Critics, however, were quick to point out the dangers. MotoGP isn't world superbikes. The heat transfer of carbon brakes is a different beast, and the Stopie style that works for one lap might destroy a front tire over 25 laps. Paddock veterans warned that Toprak was playing a dangerous game, pushing the bike to its limits before he even understood the complexities of MotoGP electronics. But Toprak didn't seem to care. He wasn't just fighting his rivals, he was fighting the expectations that had been placed on his shoulders since his very first race in Turkey. He knew that for many, he was the last hope for a Japanese manufacturer revival. The weight of an entire industry was on his back, and the world was waiting to see if he would crumble or soar. The twist in the data just as the excitement reached a fever pitch, a final piece of information from the Silverstone test surfaced, and it left the engineers stunned. It wasn't just the braking points that were extreme, it was the mid-corner recovery. Telemetry showed that when the M1 V4 would inevitably begin to slide or lose front-end grip, moments that would usually result in a severe high-speed incident, Toprak was using his rear brake in a way that defied the bike's software. He was manually stabilizing the bike, overriding the electronics with pure feel. This meant that Yamaha didn't just have a fast bike, they had a rider who could compensate for the bike's unfinished development. It was a disputed advantage that rival teams claimed was impossible to replicate. Yamaha had found a human solution to a technical problem. But what happened after that left even his closest team members stunned. The New World Order, the 2026 MotoGP season, is no longer just a race, it's a revolution. The Silverstone test proved that the era of gentle Yamahas is over. The V4 is real, it's loud, and in the hands of Toprak Razgatlıoğlu it is terrifying. The power structure of the paddock has shifted. Ducati is no longer the only powerhouse on the straights. Aprilia is no longer the only innovator in the corners. Yamaha has reinvented itself in the image of its most aggressive rider. As the teams head to the first official test of the season, the eyes of the world are on the Turkish flag. The narrative is set. A clash of extreme philosophies, a battle of raw talent versus engineering perfection, and a rider who refuses to follow the rules of physics. The 2026 season didn't start on a racetrack in Qatar. It started in the shadows of Silverstone, with the smell of burnt rubber and the roar of a V4 revolution. The question is no longer